Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit. All praises, all praises, all praises to the heavenly, holy, almighty creator of infinity, eternity, the universe, and all there is. This is Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit. Hello, family. We are back together again for another spiritual expression and examination of our carnal existence. All praises. And we are here in the zone of warmth, comfort, safety, and love as we continue with the edification and education of the holy hidden nation. All praises. And to my brothers and sisters of the world, of the global diaspora, my submission of peace and blessings to you as we navigate these continents of confusion. And so, family, we're back here again as part of our critical race theory analysis. We are going to be reviewing a couple of video clips and going over a little history this evening. So, as we wipe off our spiritual lenses and clear out the canal of our spiritual ears, we will get ready for us to continue with our mental marinations and our spiritual ascendancy as we come back to the true heritage, the true mission, and the true power of our nation. And so, critical race theory, it is the brewing political point of the time. Critical race theory, reviewing history through the lens of the institution of American slavery, beginning pre-1600s, and how the American institutions were erected and maintained through this filter of the free labor and bondage of a whole people over the course of centuries. And so we will begin our review critically by looking at a massive resistance and opposition to what is called critical race theory. And so, family, we shall begin.
I don't know about you, but telling my child or any child that they are in a permanent oppressed status in America because they are Black is racist. And saying that white people are automatically above me, my children, or any child is racist as well.
The United States of America is a great and wonderful land with freedom for all. Please teach that.
This critical race theory or equity curriculum cannot be implemented in our schools. It is anti-American and a blatant Marxist agenda to divide, not unite, and to enforce the destruction of our great nation.
You talk about critical race theory, which is pretty much going to be teaching kids how to hate each other, how to dislike each other. That's pretty much, I don't care what you say, it's pretty much what it's going to all come down to. You're going to deliberately teach kids, this white kid right here got it better than you because he white? You're going to purposely tell a white kid, oh, the black people are all down and suppressed. How do I have 2 medical degrees if I'm sitting here oppressed? How do I get, only got 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 medical degrees, no mom, no dad in the house, worked my way through college, sat there and hustled my butt off to get through college. You gonna tell me somebody that looked like all y'all white folks kept me from doing that? Are you serious? What's sickening about this whole thing is what y'all doing right now is already something I do in my community right now to speak out against stuff because black folks are getting told by other black folks, oh, you know you ain't gonna be able to do nothing out there in the world because white folks ain't gonna let you get no, oh, you know you're not gonna be able to do it because you know the white man gonna keep you down. Well, how did I get where I am right now if some white man kept me down? How am I now directing over folks that look just like you guys in this room right now? How? What kept me down? What oppressed me? I work for myself from off the streets to where I am right now. If you gonna sit here and tell me this lie of critical race theory, of this the reason why black folks can't get ahead because of white folks? Are you kidding me? This is what we come to now. I can't believe we even talking about this right now. The last thing I'm gonna say right here is something that's crazy. Martin Luther King said he wanted his kids to grow up in a world where they are judged by the contents of their what? Their character, not their skin. If they letting this stuff go on right now, it is absolutely doing the complete reverse of what he's doing. So when February comes, don't talk about Martin Luther King. When February comes, don't talk about black people. My job will sit there and just pretty much be on this grave with this nonsense. That's exactly what's about to happen. When it all comes down to it, the person that's going to be suffering from this, the ones going to be hurt from this, is the kids. 10 years from now, if this stuff goes on, whose fault is it going to be? Whose fault is it going to be? Who we going to look back on and blame for this? Because this is stuff we're talking about right now. This stuff is going on right now. I do this stuff on a daily basis. I'm in the hood. I'm in the communities. I'm out there with folks in their face. I've been doing stuff since I was 18 years old, talking to black folks. You know what? None of them are buying this nonsense. None of them are. But if you want to implement this into the school system, I guarantee you to the day that I die, I'm going to be the very person right there debunking stuff, tearing stuff down, letting them know they can do exactly what I did and get exactly where I am by putting themselves to work and getting there. Ain't not one white person ever gonna keep any of them from getting there. So C.R.T. stuff, BS.
That is why today we are announcing our plan to
critical race theory and the new massive resistance. So family, we're going to get a piece of history from a brother and sister who grew up in the earlier parts of the 1900s. So we can get a additional piece or an additional perspective of critical race theory. Why some are comparing the national backlash against anti-racist teaching to Virginia's strident campaign to resist school desegregation after Brown versus Board of Education. Arnold Ambers was still a teenager when he woke up at 4 a.m., jumped behind the wheel of a rickety bus, and shuttled dozens of children to a nearby segregated elementary school. Much of the fleet lacked heat, and on the coldest mornings of those Virginia winters, he'd pull over on the side of the road to brush ice off the windshield with worn towels. After finishing the route, Ambers arrived late to his all-black high school, named in honor of the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, which remained racially segregated despite the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education years earlier. As Ambers bused children to racially isolated schools, even after the court found such segregation unconstitutional in 1954, officials fought tooth and nail to keep it that way. As one of the nation's last holdouts, London County schools remained racially isolated until desegregation in 1968. Such discrimination was so pervasive that it became baked into Amber's perception of normality. That was the sign of the times, the 79-year-old Amber said, recalling how Leesburg Theater, but by the time he enrolled up, well, recalling how his family was barred from many public places outside the balcony of a Leesburg theater. But by the time he enrolled at Shaw University, a historically Black institution in North Carolina, he'd had enough and joined civil rights protests, marching and singing songs like "We Shall Overcome." But white folks didn't take kindly to Black people demonstrating, and he'll never forget the occasion an irate white man spit on him. It's one of the most degrading things you could ever do. These days, Amber's is on edge. The racial strife that engulfed the county in the last several years, he said, brings back memories of Jim Crow. This year, London County has become ground zero for a national uproar over schools' use of critical race theory, a legal concept that seemingly has been bastardized to encompass any instruction about systemic racism and Black Americans' enduring struggle for racial equality. That strife came to a head at a school board meeting in June when one man was arrested and another injured after the gathering descended into chaos as parents protested critical race theory with signs that read, "Education, not indoctrination." It's painful to realize that we've come a long way, but in the last 5 years, we've really gone backwards quite a bit, Amber said. And I guess the painful reality is that racism has always been there. For some observers, the backlash is part of the complex, centuries-old history of racism and oppression that some educators have sought to confront, particularly after George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer in May 2020. Specifically, they've likened the blustering rhetoric of critical race theory's staunchest critics and legislative efforts across the state to prohibit teachers from discussing systemic racism to massive resistance, an effort by white segregationists in Virginia to thwart school desegregation for years after the Brown decision. So, family, the same spirit, the same energy, the same hatred is embroiled in these same peoples here at 2021 as we speak, since before the Supreme Court's decision officially. So we're just discussing, let's say, a 90-year period. Among them is Julie Briskman, a Democratic member of the London County Board of Supervisors, who referred to the current upheaval as the massive resistance of our generation. Sherilyn Eiffel, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, which litigated Brown, quipped that segregationists and the current dissidents mobilized around a singular force, the unifying power of whiteness. Locked out. While white segregationists employed legal and sometimes violent tactics to evade school desegregation, critics said that similar strategies are now being leveraged to block educators from teaching about the very historic reality, or from teaching about that very historic reality. So the same people who were committing those same acts of violence, oppression, torment, and terrorism are bringing out, or those same tools were passed down to the next successive generations. As the rancor reaches a favorite or fever pitch nationally, some parents have pulled their kids from public schools, and others have touted private school choice as an option to shield children from curricula permeated with ideas we find toxic. So the idea of teaching American history and the violence of some people who wanted to maintain oppressive institutions is toxic, family. In July, a teacher in Tennessee was fired for teaching students about racism and white privilege. Meanwhile, on Fox News, which has warned against the danger of critical race theory thousands of times this year, pundit Tucker Carlson suggested, next to a graphic of the Democratic Party logo and the words anti-white mania, that classrooms be equipped with cameras to ensure teachers aren't filling impressionable young minds with civilization ending poison. In nearly half of states, Republican lawmakers have introduced legislation this year that seeks to limit how educators discuss racism and other divisive issues. And in 10 states, such bans have become law. Under a new Tennessee law, for example, public schools could lose funding. In Arizona, teachers could lose their licenses or have them revoked. Jen He Lee, the senior deputy director at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, finds the current efforts similar to resistance to desegregation in that both operate on nostalgia that fails to recognize how educational inequities upheld by the status quo marginalize Black children and could be detrimental by further destabilizing public education. The idea that any efforts to engage and remedy that problem is somehow itself harmful to other children is beyond ironic. It's really quite tragic, she said. An accurate accounting of history and the requirement that all children be treated equally and to be included is beneficial for everyone. Jamel Donner, a critical race theory expert and associate professor of education at Virginia's College of William and Mary, also sees similar parallels between the backlash to critical race theory, which he called a boogeyman, and Southern resistance to school desegregation. Even to this day, K through 12 schools are starkly divided by race, and integration efforts remain divisive, even in northern enclaves like New York City. In both instances, he said, the uproar centers on resistance to inclusion. First, it was the inclusion of Black bodies, he said. Now, it's the inclusion of ideas and materials that purport to provide a more holistic picture, a more holistic understanding of the experiences of people of color in the United States. Jonathan Zimmerman, an education historian at the University of Pennsylvania, acknowledged similarities between massive resistance and the current backlash with outright racism as a key motivator, but several differences muddle the analogy. Massive resistance after Brown was a battle over the Constitution and its interpretation, he said, while the current feud is largely about American identity. Many white Americans in particular are deeply invested in a narrative of America that's being challenged. And while he doesn't endorse their perspective, he said they come from a correct perspective or perception that these stories represent a radical difference from the stories they were invested in. So, the illusion of what these people learned or believe is now at this time in history, family, being taken or snatched away from them. Their investment in their historical beliefs is failing. Meanwhile, he said that in some cases, the most ardent proponents of anti-racist teaching have imposed their opinions about history on students. Laws that bar students from discussing divisive topics have the same effect. All truths are subject to interpretation, and there is no singular, unvarnished truth, he said. Never has been, never will be. The very existence of the very existence of the segregated Douglas School, where Ambers graduated in 1960, was a feat in itself. To the backdrop of white resistance, members of London County's Black community, including Amber's father, held chicken dinners and other fundraisers to buy a plot of land on the outskirts of Leesburg for the county's first high school for Black children. The school was built in 1941 after organizers sold the land to the county for $1, and the county's Black community raised money to fill the building with desks and books. Ambers and other students at Douglas weren't offered the same opportunities as the county's white children, and almost immediately after the Brown decision was released, white officials in Virginia and across the South vowed to keep it that way. A prominent force was Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, who blasted the Brown decision as the most serious blow that has yet been struck. Against these states' rights, it was an argument that echoed the lost cause, which Confederate officials sought to inaccurately portray the Civil War as a feud over local control rather than an effort to uphold slavery. Virginia officials created the Gray Commission, which recommended officials amend the state compulsory attendance law so white children didn't have to attend integrated schools, and the creation of tax-funded tuition grants so parents could send their children to private institutions known today as segregation academies. 2 years later, Byrd launched a campaign that became known as Massive Resistance, that included a collection of laws aimed at preventing integration, including a policy to pull funding from schools that allowed Black and white children to sit in the same classroom. Through newly created tuition grants, money from closed public schools was funneled to private schools that weren't bound by Brown's mandates. After the school closure law was found unconstitutional in 1959, state lawmakers repealed school attendance rules and created a local option that gave cities and counties authority to close schools. In London County, educational inequities upheld by racial segregation were felt in teachers' salaries, transportation, and facilities. At the Bull Run School, Black children bought lumps of coal each morning to provide the building with heat, and others hauled in water from a nearby stream. Shortly after Brown, county officials voted to let students use public education funds for private schools, in effect, allowing white families to cover tuition costs while sidestepping integration. In a resolution, officials voted to stop public funding if the federal government forced integration, a reality that came to fruition only after years of legal battles. But the animosity lingered long after, and white resistance extended beyond public education. In the mid-1960s, Black youth wanted to swim in Leesburg's public pool, but the volunteer fire department filled it with rocks and cement rather than see that happen. The town didn't get another public pool until 1990. Perhaps the most significant effort to resist desegregation unfolded in Prince Edward County, a rural Virginia enclave with deep ties to the Brown decision. It was here in 1951 where Black high school students from Farmville went on strike over poor school conditions and sued for equity. Their legal struggle was ultimately one of 5 cases consolidated into the Supreme Court's Brown decision. Years later, however, segregationists retained the upper hand. Under pressure from 2 court desegregation orders in May 1959, officials chose to close the county's entire public school system for 5 years rather than comply. White children were allowed to enroll in the private Prince Edward Academy, which became a model segregation academy for communities across the South. And many Black children who were excluded from enrollment and unable to use tuition grants elsewhere were effectively locked out of a formal education altogether. Rather than focusing on race, white residents in London County often spoke fondly of their Black neighbors, and much of their rhetoric justifying the school closures centered on school privatization. local control, and taxpayer rights. The Farmville Herald's publisher at the time, a staunch segregationist, asserted in an editorial that if Virginia, the mother of constitutional government, allowed school integration, it would have permitted the rape of ideals and principles for which great men have given their minds and blood, suffering almost unbearable hardships. Christopher Bonastia, a Lehman College professor and author of Southern Stalemate, 5 Years Without Public Education in Prince Edward County, Virginia, described the massive resistance strategy through a simple quote: "If we can legislate, we can segregate." Now, he said, some critical race theory critics have adopted a similar game plan. It seems to me that the theory is if we can legislate, we can obfuscate, meaning that if we don't allow this teaching of how racism is sort of baked into U.S. law and policy and practices, then we can maintain this racial innocence. He also sees similarities between the two camps' overall rhetoric. This claim to colorblindedness, which happened in Prince Edward, that is the kind of claim of the anti-critical race theory folks who question why children should learn to be race conscious instead of viewing everybody as equals. He, Lee, of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, made a similar connection, noting that claims of colorblindedness have been used to entrench existing racial disparities for generations. It ignores inequalities that exist, and it ignores important conversations to try to remedy those racial inequalities, she said, claiming color blindness does not make inequality just magically disappear. In fact, it's very important for us to identify and examine inequalities that do exist. Southern whites are the Negro's best friend, but no integration. That's American history, family, every day, all day. As Black students in Prince Edward County and elsewhere fought for educational equity, their struggle was about far more than access to white schools. The transformative vision of school integration also included desegregating curriculum in which African American experiences and voices were included in classroom instruction, said Jarvis Gibbons, an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, Gibbons traces the life of the father of Black history and highlights how anti-racist teaching practices have long been a staple of Black educators' approach to instruction, and doing so has always faced resistance. To define fugitive pedagogy, Gibbons turns to the actions of Tessie McGee, a Black history teacher from Louisiana, who in the 1930s kept a copy of Woodson's book on the Negro on her lap, reading passages to students in defiance of state and district laws. Through her actions, Givens wrote McGee explicitly critiqued and negated white supremacy and anti-Black protocols of domination. But they also often did this in discreet or partiality in a concealed fashion as part of a larger vision to dismantle Jim Crow segregation while celebrating African Americans' contributions to society. She and others did this at grave risk of getting caught. For many Black educators, that was a real threat as they face relentless suspicion and surveillance. Such surveillance, similar to Tucker Carlson's call for cameras in classrooms, has been endemic to the experiences of Black teachers historically. Now, contemporary calls to police classroom instructions is worrisome, he said. Now we're seeing it out in the open because a lot of folks are being given permission to kind of surveil what teachers are teaching, he said. And whether or not it adds up to their vision of what it means to be patriotic and American, and whether or not it's consistent with the stories that they've been told that we need to tell about the past of Americans' history for so long. Despite Black educators' long history offering anti-racist instruction and being subjugated to surveillance to prevent it, Givens said the issue has taken on a new form in the last year. Parents are so up in arms this year, he argued, because the instruction is being offered to white kids who are being asked to confront issues of racial inequality. I think the falling out has to do with the fact that there's a lot of white people who don't want their children learning these sort of narratives because of what it implicates about their own identities in certain ways and the ways it names whiteness in explicit ways that causes discomfort for people, he said. That's what's really at hand here. What happens when we decide to include Black history in ways that go beyond the terms of what's comfortable for white Americans? Zimmerman, the University of Pennsylvania historian, said the current moment creates an opportunity for educators to present American history for multiple perspectives and allow students to grapple with the lessons rather than prescribing their own views. Yet, partisans on both sides, he worried, are disinterested in an honest debate. I want more nuance, he said, but to be as direct as possible. Who the heck am I? How many people actually do want that? And how do we make a case for that? For 45 years, Virginia's efforts to defy Brown were placed on a pedestal outside the state capitol in Richmond. That era came to an end in July when a 10-foot bronze statue of segregationist Senator Byrd, the massive resistance architect, was removed from its perch and hauled off to storage. Yet, Much of his legacy carries on unabated as schools across the country remain starkly segregated by race, and some communities continue to leverage tactics such as school district secessions to resist integration. Some of the very groups leading the charge against critical race theory are also engaged in efforts to block ongoing desegregation efforts today. In New York City, where public schools are among the most racially segregated, students filed a lawsuit this year arguing that the city's use of selective admissions screens at its sought-after high schools, long seen by some as hurdle keeping Black and Hispanic children from these same lauded campuses, which violates the state constitution. The lawsuit calls on the city to scrap its competitive admissions practice. A new group called Parents Defending Education, which offers an indoctrination map to fight indoctrination in the classroom by exposing educators promoting harmful agendas, sought to intervene in the New York City case. The student group's efforts to strike down race-neutral admission screens, the groups wrote in the court filing, is intentional racial discrimination, plain and simple. Plaintiffs believe the best way to achieve equity is to focus on race and to break the parts of the city school system that are working. The group, which didn't respond to requests for comments, noted in court papers. Plaintiffs believe the best way to achieve equity is to focus on race and to break the parts of the city school system that are working. The group, which didn't respond to requests, noted in legal papers. Okay. Despite the persistence of racial segregation in schools, some school leaders have sought in recent years to grapple with the past and how it still affects the education system today. After George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, for example, the head of a private school in Montgomery, Alabama, wrote an open letter about the role his school played in resisting desegregation. The Montgomery Academy opened in 1959 as an all-white school and was seen by many as one of the earliest catalysts for the white flight from Montgomery's public schools. We must be willing to confront the uncomfortable fact that the Montgomery Academy, like many other independent schools founded in the South during the late 1950s, was not immune to the divisive forces of racism that shaped this city and community over the course of its history. John McWilliams, who didn't respond, wrote in the letter. In his views, he wrote, Black Lives Matter's protests that engulfed the country had clear ties to a centuries-long struggle. I believe that we are witnessing the cumulative impact of over 400 years of white supremacy, racial division, and discrimination play out in our streets and cities across the country. Ambers, who ironically finished his professional career as a bus driver in Virginia's Fairfax County, retiring in 2015, has been forced to face how racism in Leesburg schools persisted long after he left. Just recently, his 3 children, now adults, detailed to him for the first time how they experienced racial discrimination in the system long after the district was formally desegregated. They were called the word nigger, and during Black history, they were asked to explain things like they were considered slaves, he said. They were treated like, well, you're supposed to know about this, so tell us about it. Several years ago, the school district began to address issues of racial equity after high-profile reports found inequities negatively affected the academic progress among students of color, prompting school leaders to create a plan to combat systemic racism, including teacher trainings that focused on helping educators foster racial consciousness. Then, in September 2020, officials issued a long overdue apology to the Black community for joining in the campaign of massive resistance decades ago, while noting that much work must be done to fully correct or eradicate matters of racial inequality in the county. The officials wrote that county educators must continually assess the status of racial equity in the school system and correct its past transgressions as it pertains to race. Even in the face of backlash and intimidation, Briskman, the county board of supervisors member who gained notoriety in 2017 when she gave former President Donald Trump's motorcade the middle finger, vowed to carry on. The work is not going to stop, she said, and we are not going to be threatened. Well, family, that was a nice piece of a historical overlay where we have seen opponents of critical race theory espouse their points of contention. And we have walked through the trails of history to document the realities of the Black American experience in America. So there is a wall, a line, a spirit of hatred that will not allow the acts of torment and terrorism to be known, discussed, or evaluated for fear it will destroy the overall image created of American freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Family, let us continue with our deliberation and mental marination as we continue with our exponential expansion, as we expose ourselves to these increasing events so that we become wise yet harmless. So if love, education, truth, patience, and light destroy the darkness, we shall continue in our growth. We shall continue in our escalation and elevation as members of the holy hidden nation. A continuing analysis, assessment, and view of a critical race theory, the true explanation, evaluation, and dissemination of American history. And family, we will return. We will be back together again. And please view, subscribe, share, and if your heart so is inclined, send support in love, in truth, and light. We will come back together again in that same spirit, and we will endure and persevere until we overcome. All praises. So, family, until we are together again, I love you. I love you. I love you. This is Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit, an evaluation of the critical race theory. I love you all and stay safe. Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit.